Hello and welcome to Big Deal. Today we'll discuss the global trends in the area of litigation, and we have with us two special guests from the legal side. Globally renowned litigation lawyer John Quinn, who's traveling to India at the moment and did spend time with us. And we have with us the corporate legal leader, Cyril Shroff from Cyril Amarchand Mangaldas. Gentlemen, so good to have you on CNBC-TV18.
Thank you so much for having us, Nisha.
Thanks for saving time for us, John, in your hectic visit to India.
Pleasure.
I want to understand, how are the global litigation trends really emerging? And we want to understand from that standpoint how India is catching up with that.
I mean, clearly one area of focus around the world, certainly in the US and the EU and elsewhere, is competition law, competition claims, antitrust claims, abuse of monopoly and the like. That's one clear area of focus. I would say a second area is everything relating to data. Data breach, claims arising out of breaches of data kept by companies, privacy type claims, and then something else I'm sure we're going to get to is artificial intelligence and claims arising from artificial intelligence.
That's right.
One other area I would mention is ESG and climate change. You see challenges to companies for not having appropriate policies or measures for dealing with climate change. You see new regulations in the EU and elsewhere requiring companies to have plans to deal with reducing carbon emissions. You see claims relating to greenwashing, where companies are making claims that their products or services are environmentally friendly where they aren't, regulators stepping in. I'm sure climate change is going to be a big area of litigation globally.
That's right. And in fact, the biggest takeaway is also the new emerging trends globally in terms of businesses. So whether it's energy transition, digitization, or even the new rules for corporate governance. This is the biggest takeaway really coming in. Cyril Shroff, how is India in terms of litigation trends at the moment? And are the new types of businesses and businesses of the future causing a lot more litigation here?
I'll answer the Indian question, but I'd just like to add one more global trend. Is both countries like US as well as probably UK are extending their long-arm jurisdiction and getting involved in enforcement across the world, and we feel that in different parts of the world. Now, coming to India in terms of litigation trend, I think there's a bit of the past as well as what to expect in the future. I think our litigation system continues to be slow, and it's a function of the sheer volume of cases that we have. So that's a continuing trend. The other trend that we have seen develop over, I would say, the last 2 decades, but intensified more recently, is the increasing tribunalization of different parts of our dispute system. And this is a particularly pronounced trend in India, where once there is a special topic, because the court system is so overburdened, you send it to a specialized tribunal, which does not, unfortunately, necessarily mean that things move faster.
Yes.
But at least there's a separate forum that kind of deals with it. And there's a whole discussion that can be had on whether tribunalization is good or not. The third point I would say is that broadly, I think due process is still intact, but we occasionally do find it, whether, say, for example, the Competition Commission or other forums as well, that very often the tribunals are not properly staffed, and then you can't really proceed because you've got a missing member, or natural justice has not been followed. So the kind of due process expectations that one would expect in a regular court are not necessarily followed in the specialized regulatory bodies or tribunals, and that lands up creating even more litigation, because one of the two sides is the losing side is going to have a go at whether this was a decision that was properly sort of arrived at.
So given the backlog of the Indian courts, and we are a litigating nation, we are argumentative Indians,
Yes.
So there are a lot of disputes. So is arbitration becoming more important now, Mr. Shroff? And also IFSC has great ambitions of becoming an arbitration center now.
Yeah, so two questions over there. I think India has directionally moved towards what's called alternate dispute resolution, of which arbitration is one part of, and both the legislature as well as the judiciary pushes you towards arbitration. And we've had a checkered history of ups and downs with some sort of bad decisions and not. But where we are now is arbitration is becoming an increasingly stable option as well, both for domestic as well as international arbitration. But the outcomes are very different. Firstly, it's a very private forum.
Yes.
Everything that happens in an arbitration is not for public view. So arbitration is encouraged. I think there is a developing trend on mediation as well, and different versions of it, but there's still a long way to go.
Right, long way to go for India. But John, how do you see it globally and in your part of the world in terms of the kind of role that enforcement agencies play, and also some of the anecdotes of how the laws are now evolving and rewritten because of the new businesses coming in and new types of litigation that we are seeing?
Well, from the standpoint of the U.S., I guess the United States Department of Justice is kind of famous globally for the broad reach of their own view of their jurisdiction. You know, if a transaction involves dollars, if it involves travel to the U.S., if somebody was on an airplane that touched down at JFK, if there's an affiliate bank in the case of the banking industry in the U.S., the Department of Justice's view is they have a very broad jurisdiction. They're prepared to litigate that issue, but it's a very broad in reach. And so we see the Department of Justice in this administration very much focusing on fraud and corruption around the world.
Yes.
Foreign Corrupt Practices Act claims, that is, companies getting business by paying money to government entities, money laundering. And one thing that I think is going to become increasingly important are sanctions.
Yes.
And investigations and charges being brought against companies and individuals who are facilitating the evasion of sanctions, especially directed to Russia.
Yes.
So there's no question that that is a hot topic now. Anyone who is doing business with a party that's sanctioned, especially if it's Russian sanctioned, I think is facing a risk at this time from the Department of Justice.
That's, John, a very hot topic of discussion, but also very political. And the Indian point of view is very different on that. But Cyril Shroff, I want you to throw more light on the kind of enforcement agencies' actions that we have seen in the US. Of course, a lot of Indian companies are very global. We have, with time, learned how many of the enforcement agencies and regulators behave so that we know what we are getting into. How do you see this particular aspect and the impact of Indian businesses of litigation trends in the US as well as the enforcement agency actions?
So this has been actually developing over many years, because the US has always believed that it has its long-arm jurisdiction which extends beyond the borders of the US. And the DOJ, as well as agencies like the SEC or the FDA, there's so many of them that continue to believe that even if there were actions which took place outside, could be brought to action or and tried in the US legal system, and even antitrust claims as well. We've had parties in India who could have been perceived to have violated US competition laws, and they're being investigated and sued as well. So I think it's a long-term trend of the US enforcement agencies being very aggressive, and with each changing administration, it kind of varies a little bit up and down, but the broad trend, I think, continues, and many Indian companies feel the heat, and that's when they need lawyers like John to defend them.
That's right, and this is a very evolving situation, but we'll discuss more about litigation trends globally and what does technology as a role has to play in terms of not just the developing law in litigation, but also legal business per se as well, the use of artificial intelligence, all that and more coming up on the other side on Big Deal. Stay tuned.